You hear that? That's the sound of what JRPGs have the power of creating. It's an extremely integral aspect to this form of media. In Nobuo Uematsu's words, I believe that there are still people who believe that game music is something equal to just an effect incorporated into the game, something like a BGM, and therefore that is something that I would like to show that is not true. And I'm sure many others echo those same sentiments, that music in games are just as important as the narrative filled within a JRPG. And arguably the most important aspect depending on the franchise. When I started playing JRPGs, I was not ready for the abundance of musical visions that I would experience throughout the course of my journey into these games. Each one seemed to ooze with style and expression, as if you were delving deep into the minds of these musical icons that filled this industry. Figures such as Nobuo Uematsu, Masayoshi Soken, and Yoko Shimomura, just to name a few. Even when a game calls for a specific theme or a central feel to the soundtrack, these composers always have their own flair to give, and I for one always look forward to a good JRPG soundtrack. And as Nobuo Uematsu's quote read earlier, music composers write not to just add background noise and leave it as an afterthought, but so much more than that. And that brings us to our first point. It becomes very clear when you begin your adventure in a new JRPG title that the first thing you hear is its main theme and the central tone of said game. And already off the bat, it gives the player a set expectation of what they'll experience along the course of their journey. However, there are many cases where the theme really just describes one little bit of the entire soundtrack. Maybe because the composer may choose to write a unique tone and feel for each specific encounter, rather than a tone for the entire game, if that makes sense. Take this moment from Nier Automata, for example. Characters in this story, 2B and 9S, are tasked with investigating missing android units in this sort of carnival themed area. And as you traverse through this stage, the music here is sort of playful yet creepy in a way. It's only when you get to the boss of this stage, Simone, that the music completely changes, and Simone herself actually starts singing the background music as a creative way to have the music kind of describe Simone's despair. And this section is unlike any other in the game. And so having a certain tone in music, whether that's for the whole game itself or a specific encounter, setting a tone can really tell the player all sorts of information. What the game may be centered around, or perhaps even the game's setting itself. All of that really just comes off of how well the music is presented, and I think that's extremely important, especially for first impressions. Now, when it comes to music in JRPGs, my favorite thing about them is how they're able to tell a story in regards to what's happening in that specific scene in that moment. When you're walking through a forest, the music would probably be angelic or calming in a way. That alone can really tell the player what they're experiencing in the game without even looking at the screen. When it comes to characters, having a motif to kind of describe them whenever they appear on screen can help the player distinguish one character from another. Take Final Fantasy VII for instance. Sephiroth acts as the Darth Vader of Final Fantasy VII, and the music reflects that even more so. It's telling you that something is going down, and that Sephiroth is the star of the show here just off melody alone. And with all of that in mind, I can't end off this section without speaking on JRPG world themes and how that relates to storytelling. Specifically, Persona 5 Beneath the Mask. You don't really notice how much of a story it's telling while you're just jamming out. How it speaks to some of the themes of the game of hiding your true self, that even when you take off your mask, that there'll always be another persona. how we concede to the views of society and adopt a mask rather than being who we really are, and that your identity is being lost at the same time. And so even when the music sounds calming and fun, the song itself could be conveying quite the opposite, or just trying to tell you what the game is centered around in general. To me, I find those things in video games, specifically JRPGs, so interesting, because the music can tell just as well of a story in a few verses right alongside the actual narrative itself. Music in games can describe a character and who they are. It can also subvert expectations, making you find a track catchy and fun, but beneath it all speaks on something much more grim, and that alone is great storytelling in music. And that actually brings us to composers simply using their music to express themselves, to show off their unique style of music, and that is something you see in every JRPG. Whether that's Final Fantasy, Nier, the Tales series, or Persona, each one provides a very different experience in what type of style they'll provide. It's always as if we're in the composer's mind themselves, listening to all the notes and instruments being laid bare before you. It really gives a sense that you're in their world now, and I think that's incredibly admirable, because this has been a part of JRPGs since its inception. You know that when you get into them, that the music will provide an experience like no other. And again, I want to use Persona as an example on how expressive the music can be, as if the composer was sending a message. Like this dungeon later on in the game from Futaba's palace, and how the music that engulfs this place is almost sad. It's as if the strings here are crying out in pain or expressing an abundance of sadness and loneliness. It's an expression of both the composer and Futaba herself. We are meant to feel what they're feeling, and so the music should express that just as well as the narrative itself. And now this example is my personal favorite, and it's from the composer of Final Fantasy XIV, Masayoshi Soken. During his development of Final Fantasy XIV, Soken was diagnosed with cancer, and so throughout the course of events, Soken never told anyone on his team in the months that followed so that they wouldn't worry. And so following that, Soken would continue on his work creating a track for Shadowbringers named To the Edge. And in this piece he created, not only was the music a reflection of the events that were transpiring in game, but a literal reflection of Soken's battle with cancer. To the Edge was Soken's story, and the lyrics echo both his experience and the players in a way that's almost chilling. This is the pinnacle of what JRPGs are capable of, and it's only something that has remained the norm and continued to blossom because of not only their talent, but creativity and willingness to express themselves into this form of media. And to me, that's incredibly inspiring. You look at JRPGs and this media in general, and you wouldn't really believe someone when they tell you that video games have some of the greatest music in the modern day. And when you've played through the JRPGs I would definitely agree with that statement. It can make you feel epic, happy, or utilize it in a way to destroy you emotionally. Because soundtracks in games represent emotions. They represent the tone of the story and how you feel for each specific encounter, whether you're in a boss fight or just taking in the sights. They can tell the player a story that relates to the events that are happening in game and really just complete the entire experience. Composers can express their own emotions and life experiences through the game's soundtracks as if we we were in the minds of these talented composers themselves. All is to say that JRPGs excel only when coupled with a soundtrack that can draw on the player's emotions to enhance what the player is already experiencing in-game, and that it can break through the barriers that its gameplay counterpart is stuck in. That when all is said and done, music in JRPGs can transcend gaming.
To